Today we're going to take this dialog that we built in the last video and extract it into a new component that encapsulates all the animation and styling so it's easier to reuse in our application. And whenever I make abstractions like this, I like to start with the calling side just to see kind of what our ideal API would look like. In this case, let's call this component a modal. Now, dialogues in Radix can actually be modal or non-modal, but in our case, this is going to be kind of a hard-coded modal version of a dialog. And next, we want the button here. This is the pencil icon that we see on the cards in the overview. And maybe we'll call this Modal.Button, just to keep it simple. And then the rest of this structure, most of this is just details for the dialog itself. We have the portal, we have the overlay here with the classes and the animation, and then we have the content. And then the actual markup that we care about in this index page kind of starts right here. We have the title, edit contact, we have this close button, and then right here we render the form. And whenever we're making an abstraction like this, it's always up to us to decide how much we choose to encapsulate inside that abstraction or not. In this case, I think having a modal that has the title and close button baked in would be nice. And then the caller can just go to town here with the rest of the contents of the modal. So thinking about the API, maybe we'll expose just a Modal.Content. And this will actually just take in the contact form right here. And for the title, we'll encapsulate that inside of our modal, and this will just be a string. So maybe this will accept a title as a string. In this case, it's going to be edit contact. And I think we also want to let the user render a controlled or uncontrolled version of the modal, just so that we can account for this use case right here, where we are programmatically controlling the open and close state with this local React state right here. So in this case, I think we want to just go ahead and copy that API right over from Radix. But this looks pretty good, and this would certainly be much easier to reuse throughout our application. So let's go ahead and start implementing this. Now I'm going to comment out all of these pieces in the middle, and we'll start from the outside in. So I'm going to come here and create a modal.tsx. And let's go ahead and grab our original dialog. We will export a default function called modal. And we can go ahead and return this. Now let's come and grab the dialog import from over here. And again, let's comment this out and just start at the outside here. So we know we want open and on open change here, and we're passing these in as props called open and on open change. So let's define these. And we'll just pass these right through. And let's go ahead and give these the type. Open is a Boolean, and on open change is a function that takes the open prop and returns nothing. And this is a Boolean here as well. So I think those types look correct. Let's come back here and go ahead and import our new modal. Okay, the app is rendering, but we're getting an error. It says that children does not exist on the type because we're passing in some children, even though it's commented out. We know we're going to want that. So let's go ahead and add children, which is going to be a React node. And there we go. We have no more type errors, but we're not seeing anything yet. Let's move on to the second component here, the button. Now, if we look at our commented out code here, we'll see that we render a dialog trigger right here. And so this is kind of what we want to map to our modals button. So to kind of pull off this .syntax API, which I like to do in my own apps, just kind of a style preference, but I like doing it. We are just going to grab this modal export, and we can attach a new component on it just like this. And in the case of the trigger, we can actually map our modal button directly to dialog trigger because we don't have any extra part of this template we want to abstract away. We want to let them render a button, pass in class name, pass in children. Basically, the API of our modal button is exactly the same as dialog's trigger. So we can just say modal.button equals dialog.trigger, and then we should be able to get rid of all of this just like that. And if we look back in our page, we'll see that we can render this now. We have no TypeScript errors, but we're not seeing our edit icon. And that's because we are not rendering our children anywhere. We can see right there, it's being unused. We just want to render this directly inside of the root. And so there we go. We see our edit icon showing up just like before, and all of the props are working just like we expect. So in general, when doing this sort of thing, just let me undo this to kind of make this point. When we are replacing code like this, where we want the caller to be able to render their own versions of the components, basically we want a flexible enough interface that they can take in arbitrary JSX, icons, pass class names. The strategy here is really to kind of squint your eyes and look at this as this hierarchy right here. You kind of want to identify the siblings that are going to be rendered next to each other and replace all of this with children, and then expose the different pieces that encapsulate all this stuff so that when they render it, we end up with the same markup right here. So that's exactly what we're doing right now. Let's go ahead and redo that work we just did. And we can see everything that gets passed in as children to our modal is going to end up here right where we're rendering children. So that's kind of the trick, is to identify that root level where the siblings start and put each one of those in their own component. And so we've done that with button, and everything's working just great. And now we have one more component that we basically want to render, right? We want to render the content over here. So if we kind of squint our eyes and look at this, we want this API to render all of this and everything inside of it. So let's go ahead and make this Modal.Content component. And instead of doing it like this is going to be an actual component with some more logic in it. So let's just make a Modal.Content component, and we're going to expose it just like this. Modal.Content equals Modal.Content. And this way we have kind of a normal function to work with. So let's grab all this markup and return this. And if we come look at the props, we'll see it takes in a title, that's a string, and it takes in children. So let's go ahead and add title and children. Title is a string and children is a React node. And now this is the fun part. We can just basically replace all of these pieces that we care about customizing with our props. And right here is the title. This close icon we kind of want baked in, so let's go ahead and import that. And instead of rendering the form right here, we are going to render children. So let's come back to our page and save this. And let's give this a shot. Looks good so far. And we don't see any errors anywhere. And let's try to make John Doe, John W. Doe. Save this. And that looks to be working great. So just like that, we've kind of encapsulated the bones of this dialog with its particular styling, with the header baked in and the close button into our little modal component that is much easier to use from the calling side. And you can see, again, basically every step of this way, you have the decision to make when you're making an abstraction about how much you want to lock down the callers, how limited you want the public API to be. Or how flexible you want it to be. And usually I only reach for these sorts of things once I'm confident that the abstraction is going to be reused a lot throughout the app. I'm having problems duplicating it. But as you can see, this is a great way to lock down the look and feel of this particular modal that we've built. All the titles are going to look like this. All the modals are going to have a close dialog up here. And you can see this is pretty easy to do, pretty quick, and now it's much more pleasant to use. Now, before moving on, there's one more thing I want to point out. We're going to see that our modal is rendering this contact form, right? So if I click edit, we're going to see the contact form. And if we look in the contact form, we're actually going to see down here this Dialog.Close button. And this is for the cancel button, which is part of the form. We didn't bake that into our dialog because we might want to let people render dialogs without a cancel button. It's really part of the form. But for this to work, and refocus the trigger and all that good stuff, we want people to be using Dialog.Close. But this is a little strange now because this is not part of our modal, right? We're importing modal right here, but then we still import dialog to use Dialog.Close. So I think it would be an improvement if we just went ahead and exposed that as Modal.Close. And this is nice because of the way that Radix works. These can be kind of in separate components, but because it's nested within our modal tree, the functionality is going to be exactly the same, just like we saw it still worked, even though we had extracted out the Radix components. So let's go ahead and just do one more export. We're going to say Modal.Close is equal to Dialog.Close. So we'll save that, come over here, save this. And now if I hit cancel, it still works, even though we're now rendering Modal.Close. So that's pretty cool. And with that, if we come up, we're actually going to see we're not using dialog at all. So we can delete that. We can get rid of the cross icon. And if we just take a look at what we ended up with, again, a very nice slim interface here. In fact, this page doesn't even know that it's using Radix Dialog at all. So again, this is where you can imagine distributing this modal elsewhere in your application or on your team. And you have a lot of control over the implementation here if you want to change certain things without the callers having to know. But since we've done all this work to make it reusable, let's actually reuse it. I'm going to come up here to kind of our root page, and let's just create a new div, and I'm going to drop in a header right here. And this header renders our app name and a button component that I have already defined in this project. It's a little styled button, something you can imagine having inside your own app. So let's go ahead and import that and that. And now we have Trello's with 3 L's and this little about button. So this code uses, an existing component from a design system. It's this little button right here. And maybe our product manager comes and says, hey, I want to click this and show a modal with some information. So let's see how our new abstraction holds up. We start by wrapping it with a modal. So let's wrap this with modal. In this case, we just want to use the uncontrolled version of the modal. We don't need to control the state ourselves like we did down here. And we're getting a little type error because both of these right now are required. So let's make open an optional prop and on open change optional as well. And that should flow through just fine to Radix Dialog because these are both optional down here. So back in our page, that looks good. Now the next step is to change our button to a Modal.Button, but here we're already rendering kind of this UI button right here. So if we were to change this to Modal.Button, we would lose that functionality. But fortunately, if we wrap this in a Modal.Button and use the asChild prop from Radix, this is going to attach all of the behavior and functionality to whatever we pass in here. So again, this is a nice little point about how limited or flexible you want your API to be. When in doubt, you can fall back on the props from Radix because it's very well thought out. And this asChild is a good example of that. We can see here that it accommodated us using our own button, even though we hadn't considered that when we first extracted our modal. But it looks like our button is rendering correctly. So now we just want a Modal.Content. And let's give this a title of About Trello. And we'll just put in some copy for now. And if we come over and try this out, check this out. Pretty awesome. And we can even replace this with some more markup here and just have a little bit of information about the app. We are using the uncontrolled version of the modal here, so we didn't have to wire up any state. This is all we had to do to turn our button into something that triggers a modal. We get the animations, we get the escape to close, we have the nice title and the close button right here. And this is just super easy to reuse and again, ensure that the styling and behavior is consistent across the application. But if we need more control, like we did with our form, then we can go ahead and use the controlled version while still hiding all of those portal details, the overlay details, the styling, and the animation. So that was just a quick look at how you might think about extracting a more reusable component from a dialog that you've built or any of the other Radix components that you've built and customized and styled. It's always a question with abstractions like this, how limited or flexible you want the API to be. My suggestion is to wait until the duplication is kind of painful. It starts hurting. You want to make a change to every modal in the app, and it's a pain in the butt to do so. At that point, it's a good time to think about how you would go ahead and extract it. And like we see here, you can just add some simple wrappers on top of your custom component, and that way you can hide all this knowledge from the calling side. But hopefully that gives you some ideas for how to encapsulate your style Radix components to make them easier to use throughout your app.